I think everyone on the sell side at this point has a Microsoft 365 Copilot revenue base case, bull case, bear case. I'm estimating that by Microsoft's fiscal year 2026, that you can get north of $9 billion in revenue from Microsoft 365 Copilot and GitHub Copilot. And I love that stat, but that's the kind of analysis that all of us do. So the thing I'm really interested in is also, what does the margin profile look like? Because that's where I've really invested a lot of my time and where I think most of the questions in the market are settling of what is the gross margin profile, and will generative AI just be like a cost center, a really cool but big cost center for businesses? And so I've really dug into that side. I built my own financial analysis and model of a tier 4 data center bottom up and approached it taking a look at NVIDIA H100 GPUs and try to fully load the costs there. And I think this is the cool part of my job and what keeps me around actually, is trying to come up with these types of analyses to figure out like what are the unit costs of running generative AI.
Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Well said, Fat Joe. Well said. And welcome to Run the Numbers, where I interview world-class CFOs, operators, and the investors who fund them on how to get the most out of your company's performance. This podcast is a playbook of sorts for ambitious people in the worlds of finance, strategy, and operations. Today, my guest is Fred Havemeyer, sell-side equity analyst at Macquarie. He leads up their AI and software research division within the United States. I first met Fred during my time in investor relations when I was working the old cybersecurity circuit. Since then, a lot has changed in terms of how organizations supercharge back office functions with technology. I reached out to my buddy Fred to get a world-class breakdown on the productivity improvements we are realistically seeing from AI today. On this episode, we cover the difference between the metrics the sell side uses versus operators like me and their day-to-day models, and how to translate and talk the talk between the two. The art and science of valuing a company, quantifying the productivity gains we are seeing in AI today, the cost models underlying large language models, and what realistic long-term gross margins for AI companies are. Is it a race to the bottom? And real-life use cases for finance people diving into their first LLMs, as the cool kids say. Fred is one of the most well-spoken analysts I've encountered. He's a technologist who also knows his way around a DCF model, and what excited me most about this conversation is the honest look we took at how AI is impacting maybe the bottom performers in an org more than the leaders today, producing meaningful 30 to 40% improvements and pulling people up to the median, but not yet getting us to that 100x developer we were promised by the visionaries. While Fred and I do dedicate a portion of the episode to AI's impact on CFOs in the back office, we also spend time discussing how valuation of any company is in the eye of the beholder, and what metrics operators should be ready to fork over when the sell side wants to take a cold, hard look. All this and much, much more after a short word from our sponsors. As a SaaS CFO, I know firsthand how difficult it is to report on SaaS metrics. We've all seen a deal close at the end of the month, but the customer's contract doesn't actually start until the middle of the next month, creating the classic discrepancy between bookings or committed ARR and actual ARR, the real stuff. That's why I'm so pumped to be partnering with Maxio, a company trusted by thousands of SaaS companies to understand these reporting nuances. They basically built and automated the SaaS dashboard I tried to manually cobble together for 3 years. In 2022, SaaS Optics and Chargify combined to become Maxio, the only billing and financial operations platform that was purpose-built for B2B SaaS. They're helping SaaS finance teams automate billing and RevRec, manage collections and payments, and put together investor-grade reporting packages. Visit maxio.com/runthenumbers to learn how Maxio can help you supercharge financial operations in 2024. Request a demo using the Run the Numbers link and receive a 10% discount on your first year with Maxio. That's maxio.com/runthenumbers. Quick math, the less your business spends on operations, on multiple systems, on delivering your product or service, the more margin you have and the more money you keep. That's the goal, isn't it? But with higher expenses on materials, employees, distribution, and borrowing, everything costs more. Yesterday's price is not today's price. So to reduce costs and headaches, smart businesses are graduating to Netsuite by Oracle. Netsuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one platform and one source of truth. With NetSuite, you reduce IT costs because NetSuite lives in the cloud with no hardware required. Access from anywhere. You cut the cost of maintaining multiple systems because you've got one unified business management suite. You improve efficiency by bringing all your major business processes into one platform, slashing manual tasks and errors. Over 37,000 companies, wow, that's a lot of customers, have already made the move. So do the math. See how you'll profit with NetSuite. Now, through April 15th, NetSuite is offering a one-of-a-kind flexible financing program. Head to netsuite.com/metrics. That's netsuite.com/metrics. Ooh, yeah, you know your boy loves some metrics. That's netsuite.com/metrics. Please go there, guys. I really need it. Welcome back to the Run the Numbers podcast. I am here with my friend and one of the smartest cats I know in the game, Fred Havemeyer of Macquarie, the head of US AI and software research. Fred, you're getting promoted every couple months here. It's hard to keep up with you, bud.
Thank you very much for having me on, CJ. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I know that you and I have worked together in the past, and I've been really happy and excited to see what you're doing here with Most Metrics, with Run the Numbers. I think that your newsletter has absolutely turned into the best newsletter that I've found and I'm reading, frankly, recommending to people.
Thank you. And we're going to clip that and blast that out to everybody. So thank you for the vote of confidence. Like Fred mentioned, we work together. So I was at a company, Sneak cybersecurity company. We were going through a period of hypergrowth. And I got to engage with Fred a number of times when he was working specifically on the sell side around cybersecurity and infrastructure. Is that where you were mostly spending most of your time?
So I've been covering enterprise software, cybersecurity, and as the long title you just read off said, AI topics now for a bit. Yeah, we were working together in a conference. It was, I think, the Montgomery Summit. It was back during the pandemic when we were all remote, and I was hosting you guys through a remote session. And it was a really interesting time too, because in 2020 and into 2021, being able to have access to good software and especially access to software that can protect your IT environment, good cybersecurity, was so critical. I mean, there was a point in time where having a cloud strategy was like an existential problem for businesses. If you couldn't reach your customers at that point in time, you couldn't do business. We're all socially distanced. So I loved getting to know both your company as well as a bunch of others in that time frame. It was a super unique phase of software.
There were a bunch of high-profile breaches back then around that 6-month period we originally met. That was pretty crazy.
Yeah, I think it was the Log4j attack time frame, right? And the SolarWinds breach was really following the back of that too. And it made for some really amazing discussions. I got to say, that's been something that's continued in the cybersecurity market. We're still talking about it to this day, as well as the fallout of the events back.
It's wild how those repercussions then still echo today. And part of, I think, the challenge back then was translating this big story you had into numbers that analysts could then take back and say, is this even a realistic forecast that they're putting out there? And one of the things that me and you used to always go back and forth on are what metrics should a company report? What should they disclose? What should they guide to? And there's always been kind of this rub between operators like myself and sell-side analysts where you work on what metrics should a company even be talking about? What should I be giving you?
I think it's one of the most interesting questions to be asking in this space, because what you're doing in most cases is you're trying to tell your story in the way that makes the most sense. And you're trying to do it also while understanding that people like me over here on the sell side are going to be trying to read the tea leaves, model your company, and peg your management team to it going forward. I mean, CJ, as you know, as a CFO, most problems of metrics are also problems of expectations management too. And whatever you give out once, you're going to be measured to in the future, measure against in the future. So you've always got to be careful about that. So I think in that point in time, it was fascinating too. That was a hypergrowth company, and I cover a lot of hypergrowth companies here. It's a fascinating space, and I think the metrics that you're giving out, the metrics that you're telling your story through, are really the most important choice you can make for a public-facing, investor-facing communication and storytelling here. Because the way that you position it through your metrics says, am I a profit story-driven story? Am I a growth-driven story? Am I purely taking market share? Am I brand new here and doing something completely different than everybody else? And you can tell that through something as simple as a net retention rate, or you can go and really drive that as well through things like ARR, annualized recurring revenue, and metrics like that. If you're on the growth side of things, I think that the metric choice is really one of the most interesting problems facing CFOs and facing those who are dealing with anyone whose expectations you need to manage, frankly.
And Fred, there's the metrics component to it, and then there's what are you looking for thematically within those metrics. So on the sell side, are you looking for momentum? Are you looking for cash flow generation potential? Like, what's the theme you're trying to distill out of those metrics?
For me, I'm focused on really good long-term growth stories, things that will be, over time, category-defining software companies. And that's why I'm actually on the sell side. Like I in this role, I'm US head of AI and software research. I get to meet with and write about and research cool tech companies. And what I'm focusing on are those companies that really have found their market, are driving that growth, and will have the opportunity over time to ease into that and get into that phase where they're generating cash flows, like durable, strong cash flow streams backed up by recurring revenue. And I think it's the beauty of the software space is that you have these really sticky models. When you find product market fit, you can absolutely gain substantial market share, create new markets, and do so with the opportunity to build really substantial business models. And it's totally different, I think, than other spaces I've looked at, like internet spaces more broadly. It's totally different than I don't think there's many who still hold out fears that we're in like a .com style business models. These are real business models at this point, with fundamental power, with margin leverage and cash flows. And so what I am looking for is that balance of a really good thematic story that's backed up by product market fit, it's backed up by a solid piece of software that's its users love, that businesses love, and that also has that real opportunity to drive cash flows along with hypergrowth. Ideally both at the same time.
So you want all of the above?
Yeah, all of the above. All the above. Give me all of the above.
Just check that box.
Yeah, there's a lot of different parts to the story. If you're a business that's growing a bit slower, but you have really strong margins, strong cash flows, I can love you too. Don't worry about that.
And part of the translation that I always have to wrap my mind around is, as an operator, I need metrics that are linked back to a distinct lever in the org that somebody can pull to make changes. But in order to tell the story to the sell side or investors, you often have to give them compound metrics. And that's a metric like an LTV to CAC, where there are multiple inputs and there isn't one owner within the org. So it's something like you're playing a very similar game, but you may be on different fields. And I don't know, some people are better. I think the really great CFOs are good at being able to talk the talk in both fields.
I think the really great CFOs are absolutely doing what you're describing here. Like if you can give metrics that, even if they're compound and we can't fully parse them from the outside, which frankly I think is probably a good thing for most companies, like giving out metrics that do tell a whole comprehensive story, but don't give people like me the opportunity to understand exactly how you're rolling those up and what KPIs you're setting and maybe how you're exactly compensating your sales org. I think that you always have to play that careful game of what are you going to give away as a CFO, as an operator, when you're translating your metric, translating your business into metrics that you want to give to investors. While also giving a comprehensive view to help us understand how is the business going, truly like what are your KPIs internally that are being translated through into these metrics. But again, like I think the translation game comes down to, how do I tell my story as accurately as possible? You want to give the good and the bad through the metrics here. You need to provide that balanced view, but also do it in a way that gives me room as an operator, as a CFO, to run my business in the way that makes the most sense while balancing that confidence being given to investors and given to the market. So it's a big challenge. And I tend to see that, I think the most common compound metrics we see that we've gotten comfortable with here on the sell side in this growth space tend to be like NRR, net retention rate metrics that show how a business is performing, rather how its cohorts of customers are expanding year over year. Not necessarily cohort by cohort, but just aggregate across the business. And then annualized recurring revenue, or even like ACV, annualized contract value metrics that again show like what is the annual run rate of all the business you've signed. You don't need to break it out again by cohort, but those tend to be two of the top line metrics that we've become most comfortable with that tell a good software story. After that, I feel like we're looking at free cash flow. Again, we're looking at these like compound metrics that tell the story of the business of what is your profitability, but more importantly, what does your cash flow engine look like? So I think any sort of like free cash flow metric that's true to the business of what your cash actually looks like, not those like massively adjusted metrics that we used to see before I think the SEC started chiding some businesses a little bit more. And profitability, of course, too, but given the ways that businesses can adjust out in non-GAAP things and profitability, it's always helpful to have like a non-GAAP profitability number or like operating margin or an adjusted EBITDA. But end of the day, free cash flow is the one that we're looking at.
Okay. So now I got you in my crosshairs, Fred. Here's the question that everybody's waiting to hear. You teed me up nicely for it. So at the end of the day, does everything I give you just end up in a DCF model?
Depends how artful you are. At the end of the day, yes, most things do end up in a DCF from my perspective. But a DCF only tells part of the story, I think. It gives you that fundamental grounding as an analyst to say, I believe that a company's future cash flows are worth some amount today based on all my inputs and my assessments. But what you're also having to take into account here is that qualitative part of what the company is doing, how it's performing, its management team, and all of these aspects, which don't actually go into a DCF, but might give analysts confidence in either adding a premium or even taking out a discount from any asset they're taking a look at here. So I think that actually, so just briefly here, like I came into equity research with a background in programming and my undergrad in physics. And I was looking for a really scientific method to finance when I first joined. Maybe I should have just become a quant. I don't know. But I love the debate a bit more than I think I loved all of the data science that went into everything. But when I got to know this sector a bit more, and I found out that it was a bit more art than science, that's when I began to understand that when companies are giving metrics and when we're approaching and assessing companies, there's a lot more debate and expectations and art that goes into the like analysis and valuations of companies than strictly like a DCF analysis. So the answer is maybe an unsatisfying both. If I'm going to be super succinct here, both your metrics go into a DCF, but then the but here is, but also you've got to be a solid management team. You have to have a good track record, and you have to do so with good, solid, clear communications about your metrics. Because at the end of the day, a DCF is only as good as the expectations that the team will actually be able to deliver on those future cash flows.
It's art, science, but also please just give me your damn ARR.
Yeah. Yes. If you give me the ARR, give me a cash flow target, I think you'll make both my day and everyone else's day a whole lot easier about when I'm thinking about your company on a 10-year basis.
Absolutely. Okay, well, maybe to transition a bit. So we've gone through the evolution of how you think about operator metrics and analyst metrics and talking both languages. I want to hone in on AI because that's where you're spending most of your time. A lot of this we'll talk about through the lens of someone who's in a CFO or COO or kind of a back office function. But to tee it up, is adoption actually happening here? Are bigger companies leaning in faster or slower than you thought? Because I don't know what to think of this.
Each time I'm tracking this market really closely. I've been extremely excited about what's happening in AI, and I think that the pace at which things are changing is just pretty astounding here. It feels like acceleration is innovating, and when I take a look at this market, each week, each month, it's looking a bit different. But enterprise adoption is happening, and I think that 2024 is going to be the year that we start seeing big enterprise adoption of generative AI products and services. I'm saying generative AI here rather than AI because, quite frankly, AI, ML, it's already deeply adopted everywhere at this point. It's standard practice. It's in every business, and each of us interact with it every single day. It's as subtle as like a recommendation engine, and it's as advanced as, I don't know, I was depositing a check on my bank's mobile app the other day, and it's able to do automatic like check detection. That's going to be an AI ML model in the back. It's going to be a convolutional neural network that's actually able to do the image detection in the midst of that there. So it's really cool. Like that already exists in our day-to-day life. And now what's happened is with generative AI coming through, we have a new way to work with computers. Like we're able to actually speak with computers, instruct them, get responses. And as we're seeing these large language models, like what OpenAI and Tropic others and Google and others are building here, they are becoming more and more capable of doing analytics, some level of reasoning, although that's a big debate right now. And I think it shows the substantial promise for how enterprises are going to be and businesses are going to be adopting this to improve how each of us are doing our jobs day to day. And I'm hopeful that it will do things like, help us to, for people like me, write reports more effectively and be able to force multiplier. I think we're already seeing, for example, like ChatGPT, I think that was the kind of like iPhone moment here for the generative AI space, because this has been tech that's been under development since at least 2017 with Google's seminal paper, Attention is All You Need, which created this concept of a transformer. What I think we're seeing this year is that post ChatGPT, all of us know what generative AI is at this point. I mean, we might not know how it works, but we know of it through ChatGPT. So it's been socialized, although many people are still learning about it. The businesses are aware of it. And through this year, what I'm seeing and hearing here is that most businesses are still piloting this tech at this point in time. Like they're taking a look at it and trying to understand what sort of ROI can it add? How is this going to be potentially integrated into my business, into my workflows? Do I have any sort of data privacy concerns? Do I have any sort of governance concerns? There's a lot of problems that are being addressed. But nevertheless, there's, I think, such a strong interest in this with, CJ, maybe you can tell me if this is happening to you, with boards asking their C-suites what is our AI strategy, that most businesses are figuring out exactly what that AI strategy looks like in 2024, what it looks like in 2025, and they're making investments today. And I think that we're already seeing like Microsoft 365, Copilot seeing some levels of experimentation and uptake. We're seeing Azure AI services taking off. I mean, Microsoft built like a $3 billion annualized run rate revenue business in about 3-4 quarters right there on the back of Azure AI services and interest in generative AI. So I'd say absolutely, like there's a lot of interest. It is here. Now we're trying to figure out how do we live with it and where does it fit?
I've had multiple board members use that exact phrase. What's your AI strategy? I didn't really know what answer to give them.
Nobody knows what it means, but it's provocative.
I love that movie. But to play back what I'm hearing, it sounds like we're past the tire kicker phase and maybe in the pilot phase. So let's try to quantify some of the productivity uplifts you're seeing. What's going on out there? Is this for real? For real?
I think it is. I think there's, back to our first part of the conversation today, we're, I think, in a game of, once again, expectations management here, because there are substantial uplifts that we're seeing. Like there's research that's out there from the National Bureau of Economic Research and a recent also Harvard study that have shown in examples like a call center, customer service agents, or consultants who are doing programming work and the like, that you can see 30% or 50% plus productivity uplifts, which, I consider that substantial. I consider that a significant productivity move. That said, some of the studies have been showing that not every employee is seeing the same level of productivity uplift here. Instead, some of the newer or underperforming employees who need a bit of help have seen some of the greatest productivity boosts towards the higher end of that range, like the 50%, 40, 50% productivity boost range. But some of the more mature and ramped employees don't see nearly as much of a productivity uplift from some of these early studies that we've been seeing coming out. So I think it's an open question right now about how much these copilots and these generative AI tools, at least in their initial phase here, might be driving productivity boosts. I think that stands in contrast with some of the early calls that I've heard from like visionaries and evangelists here, that you might see these like 10x or 100x or 1000x employees emerge that will just have these like massive, mind-blowing productivity boosts from AI and like autonomous agents and the like. So I think right now we're not seeing that, but I do think it's an open question about whether the present productivity boosts are more a reflection of how the software is implemented and integrated into workflows versus saying that maybe 50% productivity boost is all that we'll get out of generative AI, or if longer term, maybe there's a better interface or better way to work this technology into our work streams that will actually unlock those like 10x, 100x, 1000x plus employees. So I think we're waiting and seeing in terms of like whether we'll get to that point. I'm very optimistic here. I'm really optimistic after using this stuff, after using generative AI products and services, that it's more of a problem right now of finding the right interface and workflow to unlock what I think is a substantial potential to add more productivity above that like 50% boost. But, if I'm watching the market right now and if I'm considering my own job security, I'm probably looking at this and thinking, okay, maybe it's going to help my newest employees the most. And maybe it's not coming for my CFO just yet, my equities analyst just yet.
Well, I do think we had very unreasonable expectations for all of this. I think a lot of CEOs and CFOs and CTOs were looking at their org and saying, okay, so the eighth player off my bench is now going to be LeBron James. Well, no, not really. But I mean, maybe they're like starting quality now. And what you're explaining, Fred, is that AI is raising people to the median. So basically, you improve the back end of whatever your workforce is, which is still very meaningful and just from a different angle.
I think so too. I think, yeah, what some of the studies have been showing so far is that just like you said, the kind of underperforming employees, the low end of the productivity curve, are getting pulled up to the mean. And that is, I think, a really substantial improvement here. Like if you can have your entire organization operating at what used to be like the mean productivity, then like by definition, your mean is going to be moving up in terms of your mean productivity. And that's a boost right there. And I think that's really substantial. I think the expectations that we started with, though, of, again, like that 100x employee emerging everywhere, that was definitely getting ahead of itself.
It's a good start, though, and they are meaningful improvements. And if I'm looking at my P&L and most of my costs are people cost, I will take a 30% to 50% improvement on my biggest asset any day.
Oh, yeah. I think one of the questions that'll be fun to discuss in the future here is how you might be managing, adjusting your KPIs for a potential like 50% productivity boost, what that might be doing across your org.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. CRMs are slow, hard to configure, and overly complicated. Attio changes that. Attio is a radically new type of CRM built specifically for the next generation of companies. It's flexible, easily configures to your unique data structure, and works for any go-to-market motion from self-serve to sales-led. Attio automatically enriches your contacts, syncs your emails and calendars, lets you create powerful custom reports, and quickly builds intricate Zapier-style automations. Say goodbye to one-size-fits-all CRMs and outdated user experiences. With Attio, you can focus on scaling your company to the next level. Try Attio instantly at attio.com. That's ATTIO.com. That is ATTIO.com. Well, you know what I always say, maintaining compliance is never complete, which is why most security and IT teams feel like they're always in audit purgatory. I'm there right now. But there's a solution, and it's easier than you think. Escape the infinite loop by using Thoropass's compliance and audit solution. Thoropass is the only solution using AI-infused technology and in-house auditors to take your team from start to stamp without leaving the platform. As a winner of multiple G2 awards, including top awards for usability and service, your team is in good hands with Thoropass. From onboarding with dedicated experts to audits from in-house auditors who know every aspect of your framework needs, you can have complete confidence in your Thoropass compliance journey. Thoropass is the only solution to offer audits for your most needed security frameworks. I'm talking HIPAA to HITRUST and SOC 2 to ISO 27001. Woo! If you need PCI, DSS, pen tests, or any other major compliance framework, Thoropass can hook you up. With Thoropass, you never need to worry again. Relax, we fix audits. Find more at thoropass.com. That's THOROPASS.com. Tell them your boy CJ sent you. They'll hook you up. Boom. So people are becoming more productive. Let's say you pick a tool and you want to roll with it. I think a lot of CFOs are trying to wrap their heads around how the hell is this stuff priced? So what's the most common way that, and maybe you could look at it from either infrastructure or back office tools, how is AI for those kind of spheres of work priced today, Fred?
Yeah, Right now, most of the pricing is coming out in terms of a seat-based model. So you'll see like Microsoft 365 Copilot, it's priced on a seat-based model. You'll see most of the models I've seen out there are seat-based. So one really interesting component here is we see like ChatGPT is seat-based, but OpenAI's APIs are usage-based. And this is a dynamic that I think raises a lot of questions about how will the pricing evolve in the future. Because if I'm sitting in a CFO seat, I'm trying to think of how am I going to manage my costs and my spend when we're adopting generative AI. If any of this is coming through on like a usage-based model, then I'd be sitting there concerned about what happens if I get like a handful of power users that just start absolutely crushing my drawdowns, or even just like blowing through drawdowns. And what does that do to my like usage pool across the entire org? Am I going to blow through my budget? Am I going to just overrun here? And then also from the vendor's perspective, because these are generally more expensive to run than like typical software infrastructure and typical software platforms, because you're using all of this like high density compute, GPUs and the like, it raises a question about whether or not they're going to see gross margin headwinds as well. So I think on both sides, there's been this interesting dynamic from both the vendor perspective and the consumer perspective that we're seeing seat-based models certainly as like the front line for how generative AI software is being deployed. But then we're hearing and seeing that a number of these models are being approached with like a hybrid perspective too, where once some threshold of usage is exceeded, the vendor starts charging on a usage-based model. So that I think on the consumer side, you have the stability and visibility here to see and understand like what your spend is going to be on generative AI software and services. But then you also know that if you get a power user that absolutely starts blowing through whatever is budgeted into that seat, that the spend will rise. But then the vendor is comfortable with that as well, because they are not as concerned about their gross margin getting hit if they do have a usage-based component embedded in there. And I think that it does set up a future debate about how the vendor and how the consumer are going to structure the contract so everyone feels completely safe in the future under these hybrid models. But I think these are also very well-known models out there. I think most software consumers at this point are quite comfortable with usage-based models. They're quite comfortable and definitely very comfortable with seat-based models. So it's not something that is, I think, worrying about how the adoption cycle might be impacted by pricing models here, as we've seen in other sectors in the past, or with like the dawn of usage-based models in the software market. That took a little digesting for businesses to get comfortable with. But it's right now, I think, a dynamic of trying to price software in a way that is comfortable for businesses while protecting the vendor's gross margins.
I love how you tied it all back to gross margins. As a CFO, that struck a chord in my heart. Thank you, Fred.
Very welcome there. We're doing a lot of work on that.
Thank you. I do have to call out, though, that misconfiguration mistakes aren't necessarily net new to AI. I mean, you've heard horror stories of like AWS testing environments gone wrong, or someone running up like a $500,000 bill using Datadog.
I think that's certainly where we've seen like the whole sector of like FinOps emerge, where you have software now that's monitoring spend on AWS and GCP and elsewhere to try to discover those misconfigured test environments or dev environments or databases that are spun up and never spun down. And I think that cost management in cloud still is one of the biggest problems a lot of operators have to face. I think that you don't always have perfect visibility in the cloud into what's happening. And you've got to know, because one or two misconfigured cloud instances, if they're big enough, can absolutely blow through a budget. So it's not something that any of the vendors or any of the consumers, I think, are unaware of, but it's definitely a problem.
It does make awesome headlines, though. I remember a couple months back, there was a story in The Information, and it read, you know those horror stories of people who leave a faucet running in their house while on vacation for a week, returning to a flooded residence? That kind of thing is happening in AI. Ido Liberty, founder of Pinecone, a buzzy infra startup which helps developers build AI apps using their own data, said he heard about an intern at a company who accidentally spent $500,000 worth of compute because he forgot to stop some AI model testing. We'd guess that intern won't be hired when they graduate.
I mean, that sounds more like a process problem than a people problem there. I think if you're running a business the right way, I feel like you should take a look at that as a learning opportunity, not as an opportunity to fire someone.
Dude, like who's Who's throwing the keys to the car to the intern and being like, let it rip, buddy, let it rip?
You'd be surprised. I can think of back in my days of being an intern, I was given a card at the company ATM to go do a Jamba Juice run. And we did that. It was great. A little while later, someone at the company had to check the ATM balance, and they were worried when only 7 digits, not 8, were displayed in the ATM in Chinatown. And then I realized I was doing Jamba Juice runs with the company's entire like Series A, Series B raise on it. So I think it happens more than you'd expect.
That's an amazing anecdote. Jamba Juice should sponsor this podcast. Actually, are you drinking a Negroni there? What is that?
Not the first time I've gotten that. No, I'm definitely not. This is a watermelon Celsius that I put into a mason jar.
All right, Celsius, we're open for business. You sponsor every other podcast. Sponsor mine.
Talking about investments that I've missed in my life, by the way. This is not an investment opinion. This is just an observation here. Celsius was one that I missed. I saw a guy in my office back in 2017 timeframe who really into working out. He had cases of these things in the office. He had like at any given time, probably 48 Celsius under his desk. And he wasn't a brand ambassador, but he effectively was. I mean, the guy was in incredibly good shape, worked out all the time, and just drank Celsius. And I missed it. Like, that's one of those things when I'm approaching investments and I'm trying to assess markets. It's something as basic as that sometimes, is observing like when you find product market fit. And I think it's, more competitive in the consumer space day to day, but it's really the same problem you see in the software space. And that's what I'm trying to do all the time in this role, is try to find that product market fit when consumers are just loving something so much so that they end up becoming brand ambassadors for it without even being paid. It's one of those interesting problems I'm always trying to be better about.
I really like how you tied it back to the qualitative aspect of like, is this product just winning because people like it? You can quantify it through a lot of metrics. And another crazy one is liquid death. People are pulling that off the shelves like hotcakes.
Oh, yeah. I finally saw that one when I went to Gutball a couple of years ago. And the only water they had there was liquid death priced at, I don't know. Actually, they kept that they kept liquid death reasonably priced there because they wanted to encourage people to drink water in the hot summer sun in New York City. But that was my exposure to it. And I've been shocked to see that it's gotten, from the headlines, so much funding momentum behind it. But I guess at the end of the day, good branding actually trumps a whole lot if you're just selling a commodity product.
Yeah. That's the competitive mode, I guess, if it's a commodity product. Well, from canned water to AI.
Liquid debt. Consider CJ, mostly metrics. We'll take a look at you on like EV to tap water.
EV to tap water, my ratio is off the charts. Speaking of numbers, though, how is AI with numbers?
I think we're seeing the top line emerge. We're seeing the revenue emerge here. We just talked about what we're seeing with Microsoft. We have our estimates and our expectations of where that will go. I think everyone on the sell side at this point has a Microsoft 365 Copilot revenue base case, bull case, bear case. I'm estimating that by Microsoft's fiscal year 2026, that you can get north of $9 billion in revenue from Microsoft 365 Copilot and GitHub Copilot. And I love that stat, but that's the kind of analysis that all of us do. So the thing I'm really interested in is also, what does the margin profile look like? Because that's where I've really invested a lot of my time and where I think most of the questions in the market are settling of what is the gross margin profile, and will generative AI just be like a cost center, a really cool but big cost center for businesses? And so I've really dug into that side. I built my own financial analysis and model of a tier 4 data center bottom up and approached it taking a look at NVIDIA H100 GPUs and try to fully load the costs there. And I think this is the cool part of my job and what keeps me around, actually, is trying to come up with these types of analyses to figure out like what are the unit costs of running generative AI. So I built my tier 4 data center model. And what I got to is that you can run some of the bigger models out there with like a 60% plus gross margin. And you can run some of the smaller models out there, or even mid-sized models, like a Llama 2 70 billion parameter model with much higher, like 80% plus gross margins. And then if you're running, for example, small models, like 7 billion parameter purpose-built generative AI models, I'm estimating that you can run those with 90% plus, like very software-like gross margins. And that gave me a lot of reassurance here that this is not going to be a space that is just going to be a gross margin drag on these highly scaled or or hyperscalers or big software businesses, rather that these can be operated and run profitably. And what we've seen come out since we published this analysis, because, my analysis is only as good as my assumptions, and even all of that can be blown out if the data ends up coming out and proving me incorrectly here. But what we've seen so far is that some data that's been reported by outlets like The Information has suggested or said that Anthropic, for example, one of these, the creator of the Claude chatbot and an OpenAI competitor, is operating with about a 50% gross margin. So considering that Anthropic's models tend to be on the larger end or much larger end than what I've analyzed here, I'm feeling pretty good about this margin range. And I'm feeling pretty good that once these model vendors, these generative AI model vendors, are able to optimize how they're mapping demand and queries to their hardware and optimizing their utilization, you can get software-like gross margins towards that typical SaaS gross margin range at 80% to 90% gross margins. It's something I'm excited about because in this space, I think one of the top debates and questions I've gotten has been, what is the profitability going to look like? And can this be profitable? My answer is a resounding yes. I think it can be. So that's what I'm seeing in terms of the numbers for AI. I think if you're trying to take a look at AI from the revenue perspective, we're so early in the cycle right now that you'll have people like me putting out numbers on what we think specific companies and products can do. What the market can do in aggregate is totally an open question right now. I think a lot of the products out there and the technologies out there might still be a solution in search of a problem, but I think it's fundamentally a new technology that is showing that it's got real value here in a way that I haven't seen in other technology cycles in the past. I don't think we've, before generative AI, seen a really novel way to interact with computers. AR, VR, I think is astounding. I have a bit of a personal bias against it because each AR, VR headset I use makes me a little bit, nauseous. I get a little motion sick from it. So I'm never going to be part of the mainstream adoption cycle there. So maybe I have a little bit of FOMO about whether or not the Apple Vision headset is going to take off and whether I'll be left out of that. But I'm able to use AI, no problem, no nausea, maybe a little existential fear about what this means for our futures. But I really think that it's so early that it's going to be tough to say how big this becomes over time. I firmly believe that this is one of those moments where we do have a new iPhone moment, a new internet moment. And I think the adoption cycles and innovation cycles are just accelerating at a pace that suggests that this is going to play out a lot faster than the consumer cycle we saw around the debut of the iPhone or even the advent of the internet. So very early days. I'm very excited.
Some people build birdhouses on weekends. Others build out data center forecasts. This is why I love having you around, Fred. Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Reduce burn, extend runway, do more with less. Operational efficiency. These are all catchphrases that we know all too well because of the headwinds business leaders face in today's growth environment. Growth is now a battle, not a breeze. While teams are on the front lines fighting every day for top-line yardage, there are hidden savings opportunities right beneath their feet. That's where Tropic comes into play. Their procurement platform brings order and process to a historically decentralized and chaotic business function: purchasing and supplier management. Tropic serves as the front door for procurement that your entire company will want to use. By combining intake forms, pricing benchmarks, approval workflows, and supplier management all in one place, Tropic makes savings opportunities easy to find and act on. When you pour blood, sweat, and tears into revenue growth, doesn't it make sense to protect what you have fought for? Visit tropicapp.io/metrics to learn how modern businesses are controlling spend to extend their runway. Your board will thank you. Your budget will thank you. Your bottom line will thank you. What I've always struggled with is people are giving AI companies software multiples, but if you're only at 50% gross margin today, how can you confidently believe that this thing can produce 25% free cash flow margins if you run it out long enough?
With highly optimized mid-sized models, maybe specialty hardware in the future, like ASICs and the like, that are purpose-built for generative AI applications. Or if you're running collections of smaller 7 billion to 20 billion-ish parameter models, I think you have a very good shot building a very like a 80%, 90% gross margin software business that can reach those 20% plus free cash flow profile, like margin profile territories. Because when we were taking a look at this, it becomes a problem and a question of how do you optimize your usage of your hardware? Because if you're running like 7 billion parameter models, you don't need an H100 to operate that optimally. I mean, you can run it on essentially consumer hardware if you have the right software level layer optimizations. And I think that's going to provide an advantage to businesses and operators over time here who are trying to build those free cash flow generating businesses. Because if you can map the right hardware to the right problem here and batch and manage your utilization, I do think you can have that. And I think the Information recently published something about cash flow and AI. I think that they were arguing actually the first AI businesses to turn free cash flow positive might be some of those AI girlfriend startups and businesses that are just consumer facing and consumer focused. You know, I'm not here to judge how you're making or where you're making free cash flow, but at least there's a vote of confidence that some AI businesses can turn free cash flow positive. I think they can. I think most of them in the software space that aren't selling loneliness as a service are going to be able to manage to deliver free cash flow over time. But you know, I think there's some early signs in the market, at least, that there's free cash flow positivity out there.
I'd usually have a witty comment to go on the backs of the girlfriend as a service, but that one came out at me faster than I expected. And maybe I'm asking too much, because if I think about Snowflake and I kind of link that to an infrastructure cost in a lot of ways that AI will be, if I'm just looking for a comparison point. I mean, their gross margin has always been sub 70. It's usually been in the low 60s. So it would make sense that some AI companies can climb into that range at least.
A company like a Snowflake too, a lot of the gross margin profile that you're seeing is a function of how well can you both scale on your infrastructure, like your hyperscalers in their case, how well can you negotiate contracts at massive scale, and how well can you optimize your infrastructure usage too. And we're seeing this across, I think, a lot of domains, but like I think in general in the cloud operators over time have figured out how to optimize their infrastructure in a way that provides those 70, 80% plus gross margin profiles. And when I've been looking at these AI models and I'm doing my analysis from that like bottom up data center perspective, it really comes down to how optimally you can run your infrastructure. And when I've tried to approach this, I don't want to say that you're doing 100%, you're running everything with 100% utilization, because that's likely never going to happen. I mean, you can't operate your infrastructure without leaving room for some like peak load flowing through or anything. So in my cases, like I'm examining what happens when you're running with 80% utilization and you're trying to run things pretty optimally, but you're doing so in that way that gets you pretty comfortable that you still have that, like in our case, a 20% delta compared to like to feed into any sort of like peak load that rolls on through.
Fred, you'd mentioned the power of negotiations and some of these absolutely astronomically big contracts. And I'm betting on OpenAI, not because of the technology, but because Sam Altman is one of the most savage negotiators of all time.
Agreed. I mean, we saw it definitely when the OpenAI board drama happened. And within the span of 3 days, Sam was ousted, of course, but then got right back in and did so while reconstituting the board in a way that brought on the likes of like Brett Taylor, who is, of course, Salesforce's former co-CEO, founder of Quit, who has a whole storied legacy and in the future might sit on the board of basically every Silicon Valley company at this rate. And he is absolutely fantastic. And Sam Altman, through negotiation and the power of Microsoft Alliance, was able to execute that. And, you know, if I bring it back to Snowflake, actually, that's a good example, because Snowflake, through usage optimization, infrastructure optimization, and the power of negotiation at scale, has been able to drive its product gross margin up substantially from where it was at the time of its IPO. I mean, it ended 2024, its fiscal 24, with average 78% gross margin through the power of that contract negotiation at scale. And that's negotiating with the likes of Azure, with GCP, et cetera. And that's up from, it debuted with like a 68, 69% gross margin So 10, 11 points of margin expansion, gross margin expansion here through the power of negotiation and, of course, infrastructure optimization. It's really substantial what can happen when you achieve such scale.
And I just want to flag that for CFOs listening, because a lot of times we think about efficiency in terms of doing more with less, but it can also be achieved in part by negotiating for more by giving less.
And in exchange, you have a lot more guaranteed business in the future. And if you can get your vendors to concede on that one, I mean, maybe it's a goal to build a business as big as possible and then negotiate, but I'm not sure it always works out in that direction. Snowflake was already showing a lot of promise towards profitability by that point in time.
And Snowflake, they're really good negotiators. I negotiated a 3-year contract with them for my own company. I felt like I was going to war or a sword fight, and like their weapon was a sword. My weapon was a hot dog. They're savages.
Yeah, very good team there.
So some of the tools that CFOs are using will have AI built into them. What's the quality, though, of AI's ability to work with numbers? Because I'm kind of like the old guy, like saying, get off my lawn, but I've been pretty underwhelmed with some of the output when it comes to like asking AI to give me like a quantitative answer to something.
Yeah. Generative AI has been really good at handling language tasks and is catching up on numbers. So I think for now, data analyst and number-based roles are still a little bit defended from encroachment from generative AI, but I don't know how long that will last. Like, it's getting better. And part of it has been not just making the AI itself better with numbers, but improving the way that numbers are structured in prompts given to generative AI. So I think right now, if you're trying to ask AI to do math, do analysis, parse out numbers, and automate a lot of like number-based roles, you'll often find that there's going to be some errors there. You might find problems with like data transcription, numbers coming back slightly incorrect, addition, subtraction, multiplication not performed exactly correctly. And it's something that if I'm looking at it and I start seeing, and if I'm requesting generative AI presently to do an analysis that's data heavy and data driven, and it comes back with something and a number is slightly off, I am, as an analyst, going to question the entire process and likely go back and redo the entire thing myself. Just be careful, because I can't be out there publishing incorrect numbers and not knowing how the process worked in the manner of the production of those numbers. So I think right now the AI doesn't give enough confidence in its ability to work with numbers that would make me think, okay, this is going to be displacing a lot of CFO and analyst focused tools. I don't think so yet, but I think over time, there's a huge amount of promise there. And it might come through things like augmenting existing applications that are really good with structured data in a way that AI can come in and use the tools that humans typically work with to manipulate and manage that data. And I think that's where we're going to begin to see over the next year, 2 years here, more tools that are going to be AI driven within our day-to-day life. Sorry if I preempted something you're going to be asking about there.
No, that was amazing, because I think the P&L forecasting, at least for me, I just don't feel confident in the outputs yet, but I think it will change. And part of it's really the structure, I think, that you're giving AI the information in. And what you had said to me is that model builders are providing tools with access to things like Python, and that can kind of take you to the next level. Can you just speak to that?
Easily, one of the coolest parts of generative AI is that it understands how to code, because a lot of them or all of the big ones are trained with a tremendous amount of open source programming data that's on, or programming with lots of code and data, et cetera, on the internet. So one of the coolest things we've seen in the generative AI space is that it knows how to code. And so when it needs to do a data analysis, something like ChatGPT can build its own Python code to actually run a data analysis, build forecasts, and it's self-bootstrapping to some extent here. So if I'm asking, it doesn't need to be just ChatGPT. It can be other, it can be Google, it can be Tropic, it can be others. Since they know how to code, if I ask for a data analysis that it's not comfortable doing on its own based on the way that the models have been trained and prompted, these models are typically able to write their own Python code to actually perform the analysis that's requested. So when I'm considering what the future might look like here, again, it might not be that the AI itself is directly running all of these data analyses as part of these like really, really, really big portions of matrix math that are powering these AI models. But it might be more akin to like having an intern as a service here, which is a space where you would give a task to some sort of like AI assistant. Consider it like a ChatGPT or maybe the next iteration of what ChatGPT looks like. You give it a purpose, you give it a task, and you say, hey, go run this forecast. I cover Snowflake and I want to forecast out its future revenue based on historical revenue growth rates. Go run this. And like a good intern, they'd be able to go out, gather the data from the internet, and then unlike an intern, likely in the financial services space, but what you might see with AI is that it could write its own Python scripts to analyze the historical data just scraped or gathered from the internet, and then forecast that out in some manner as requested, and then return that end product to you, the analyst, to you, the CFO, and so forth. I'm excited about it. Again, it brings up the same problem, though, here of if the data is coming back inaccurate or you don't know how to work with it because you don't know the process, then you might end up just going back and redoing it yourself. But I think it shows a lot of promise about how it might reshape how we use these tools in the future.
It shows a lot of promise. Then you do get into the realm of like, if this is a black box, should I just rebuild it? And then you get, oh, it was the right answer. But it's like the one time it spits out the wrong answer, it kind of gives you pause.
I know. I think that's my biggest concern with a lot of these projects out there. And when I've run like pilot projects on using generative AI in financial services, it's one of the biggest concerns we have to address is like, what happens if the data comes back inaccurate? What happens if generative AI included something in there that's a hallucination, or hallucination means that the AI basically made something up that was not included in the context you give it, the factual data it's provided. And if you start seeing inaccuracies included in there and you can't trace it back, then it may end up shaking your trust here. So I think the systems that are being built, the software being built with AI, will need to be very good at consistently producing accurate output. Otherwise, I can't imagine, CJ, you as a CFO, I can't imagine you'd want to use something to, for example, build out like a P&L forecast if, one time out of 1,000 even is providing something completely out of thin air. You've got to know your entire data history. You need to have a complete ability to audit that history. And that's presently one of the, I think, issues that's being worked through by all businesses that are piloting it. Can I use generative AI consistently and in a manner that will produce the same results and accurate results? And it goes back to what we started the conversation with, which is expectations and frankly, trust here. Because it's very easy to lose trust. It really takes just one instance of something going wrong to lose trust in something even like AI, certainly an intern and definitely AI.
And listen, it's all just areas of risk that you're willing to put up with. People may make a mechanical mistake. I make mistakes all the time in models that I build, but people don't just, at least the people I hire, I hope, just create things out of thin air and put them into the model. And that's also wrong. It's just like a different type of risk that you're assessing.
Yeah, I think risk management is probably going to be one of the more important areas that businesses have to practice in the next couple of years as they're thinking about AI. Like, you got to have a good understanding of what sort of risk you're willing to take in exchange for the promise of this technology. And I think that a lot of businesses that are selling AI software are doing really great work on improving the governance and compliance and security frameworks wrapped around AI, and doing a great job at structuring data and providing attribution and footnotes and everything that you need to feel comfortable about where your data is coming from. So I think it does come down to how the business leaders are willing to, like business leaders at AI consumers, are willing to take on the risk of this new technology.
And maybe this is a good bookend to put on the conversation here, but one of the risks that I do worry about is what happens if I build something using AI that pulled in something it shouldn't have? Is that something that CFOs or I guess risk officers should be aware of? Could I accidentally use code or inputs that I shouldn't have and be screwed?
It's a big question that many have been asking, and we've seen high profile responses to it with like Microsoft, for example, coming out and offering like a copyright guarantee for those who are using its copilots. That is to say, if you're using like GitHub Copilot and it pulls in copyrighted code, or if you're using Microsoft 365 Copilot and pulls in some sort of copyrighted data, that Microsoft will help to defend you or will defend you against claims of copyright violations. So I think we're seeing vendors like Microsoft standing behind their products in a really big way. Nevertheless, there are, as part of the big debate that we're seeing going on about like data privacy, copyright concerns, compliance concerns, regulatory concerns, with new technology, there are many new risks. And business leaders need to be aware that there is a risk that potentially copyrighted data could be brought into their business through simple interaction with these applications.
Well, Fred, thanks for coming on the podcast. You're always one of my favorite people to talk to. You have a unique perspective on a lot of great things. And with that, the cleaners are kicking me out of my office. So thanks for joining me today, Fred.
CJ, thank you for having me on. Really looking forward to reading the next issue of Mostly Metrics and watching Run the Numbers. Thank you.
Roll the credits, producer Nancy. The Run the Numbers podcast is part of the Turpentine network of podcasts. It is produced by Nancy Hsu and edited by Justin Golden. Artwork made by Some AI Thing. Yelling and intro by Fat Joe. Don't forget to give us 5 stars. I really need this.